In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed the world was nearly his. Western Europe had fallen with shocking speed. Paris was under Nazi boots. London was being pounded night after night by the Luftwaffe. The mighty German Wehrmacht, fast, ruthless, and undefeated, seemed unstoppable. And now, Hitler's eyes turned east, toward a colossal empire he believed would crumble just as easily. Operation Barbarossa, the plan to invade the Soviet Union, was the largest military assault ever launched. 3 million German soldiers with thousands of tanks and aircraft surged across the border in June 1941. Hitler expected a swift campaign. He believed that the Soviet Union was a giant with feet of clay, a nation he viewed as racially inferior and politically unstable. In just a matter of months, he predicted victory. Moscow would fall. The Red Army would collapse, and Nazi Germany would rule the continent. But Hitler wanted more than land and power. He wanted oil, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, the rich energy reserves that could fuel his global ambitions. The Soviet Union held the resource he needed most. Without oil, his tanks would stop rolling, his aircraft grounded, his war machine lifeless. At first, everything went according to plan. The Germans pushed deep into Soviet territory, capturing city after city and taking millions of prisoners. The Red Army seemed broken. Many in Berlin celebrated what they believed to be another lightning-fast victory. Hitler began to think that he had already won. But beneath this false confidence, the seeds of catastrophe were already growing. Hitler underestimated his enemy. Not just its vast size, but the will of its people, the ferocity of its resistance, and the brutal Russian winter that would soon arrive. As his troops stretched farther and farther across the endless plains, supply lines strained. Ammunition, fuel, and food ran dangerously low. And yet, Hitler ignored all warnings. His ambition only grew. Instead of focusing on capturing Moscow, the heart of Soviet command and communication, he made a fatal decision. He shifted his attention south, toward the industrial city that bore his rival's name, Stalingrad. For Hitler, conquering Stalingrad wasn't just a military objective. It was personal, a symbolic challenge to Joseph Stalin himself. The city's capture would not only deliver control of the Volga River and cripple Soviet industry, it would be a propaganda triumph that showed the world Nazi dominance was absolute. But in chasing this symbol, Hitler overlooked a harsh truth of war. Prestige cannot replace strategy. The Führer's pride blinded him. What he saw as a guaranteed victory would soon become a battleground of unimaginable suffering. And the decision to invade Stalingrad, to push deeper instead of consolidating his gains, would begin the chain of events that turned a confident conqueror into a desperate gambler. As German troops continued forward, unaware of the storm to come, they marched toward a name that would echo forever in history, not as the site of their triumph, but as the place where the unstoppable finally stopped. Stalingrad, a city that stood like a steel gate between Hitler and his ultimate ambitions in the east. Situated on the mighty Volga River, it wasn't just another dot on the map, it was the industrial backbone of the Soviet war effort. Tanks, artillery shells, and the weapons that armed millions of soldiers were forged here, by workers who knew that every bolt and every bullet could decide the fate of their homeland. To lose Stalingrad would be devastating. The Volga, the river lifeline of the Soviet Union, flowed directly through the city. If the Germans seized it, they would choke off critical supply routes between the northern and southern fronts. Soviet troops would be cut apart, isolated, unable to reinforce or resupply. In Hitler's calculations, Stalingrad was the key to breaking the Soviet Union in two. But this city represented far more than factories and river crossings. It carried the name of Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet state. To Hitler, capturing Stalingrad would send a thunderous message to the world, even the Soviet dictator could not protect the city that bore his very name. It was to be a psychological weapon, a trophy that would shatter Soviet morale and elevate Nazi supremacy. For Stalin, surrender was unthinkable. Losing Stalingrad would be like admitting defeat before the world's watching eyes. The orders from Moscow were clear and cold, not one step back. Men and women, young and old, were mobilized to defend the city. Those who worked by day in the factories were often fighting by night in the trenches. Civilians became soldiers overnight. There was nowhere left to run, and nowhere to hide. With the German advance growing closer, the skies above Stalingrad darkened with smoke and fear. Families huddled in basements, clutching their children as artillery shook the very foundations beneath them. Evacuation was impossible for many. The river was under fire, and the enemy was closing in from the west. Those trapped inside could only pray that the Red Army would hold the enemy at bay. Meanwhile, Soviet command raced to fortify every inch of the city. Buildings were turned into strongholds. Streets became barricades. Every factory, every doorway, every twisted piece of metal became a line of resistance. Snipers took their positions. Machine gun nests prepared to unleash hell on any who dared cross their sights. The city was transforming into a fortress, a place where every Soviet citizen became a defender. As the Nazi war machine approached the outskirts of Stalingrad, German soldiers expected another swift conquest, but they had no idea what awaited them. They believed they would crush this city in days. They did not know they were stepping into a trap of concrete and fire, a battlefield engineered to bleed them dry. For both Hitler and Stalin, Stalingrad was no longer merely a strategic objective. It had become a symbol, a test of honor, pride, and political survival. The fate of nations would be decided here on these banks of the Volga River, where millions would clash for control of a single word etched into the world's memory. Out. And as the first shells began to explode over the rooftops, the battle that would reshape the course of World War II was about to begin. Stalingrad was ready, but so was the storm. By the spring of 1942, the tide of Hitler's war had begun to slow. The winter had punished his army's freezing vehicles, stiffening fingers on rifle triggers and burying dreams of a swift victory under layers of ice and snow. But Hitler was not finished. He believed Germany's survival depended on a single resource: oil. Hitler looked south, toward the vast oil fields of the Caucasus. There, in places like Baku and Makeup, lay the lifeblood of armies: fuel for tanks, trucks, aircraft, and the endless machinery of war. Without oil, the Third Reich would suffocate. So Hitler devised a new campaign, a bold but reckless gamble: Operation Blue. This plan would drive deep into southern Russia, stretching the German armies further than ever before. The goal was clear: seize the oil fields, strangle the Soviet war machine, and finally break Stalin's ability to resist. But in his hunger for petroleum riches, Hitler made a decision that would doom thousands. He divided his forces, splitting Army Group South into two massive parts. One thrust toward the Caucasus. The other was ordered to turn toward the city on the Volga. Stalingrad was a choice that left both missions dangerously weakened. Commanders in the field were stunned. They pleaded for focus, warning that dividing strength meant risking everything. But Hitler, increasingly isolated and convinced of his own genius, ignored all objections. His will, he insisted, was enough to guarantee victory. As the German advance rolled into the southern steppes, Hitler's arrogance grew. Supplies were stretched thin, and troops marched under a scorching summer sun. Dust storms choked the air. Water ran short. Engines overheated. But onward they went, for their Führer had demanded speed, and speed was all that mattered. Many soldiers believed they were close to winning the war. After all, the Soviets seemed to be in retreat. Fields burned in the distance as Stalin's forces followed a scorched earth strategy, destroying everything useful as they fell back. Homes, crops, livestock, entire villages reduced to ash so the enemy could claim nothing. Yet beneath that smoke, Soviet resistance was not broken. It was coiling like a spring, waiting for the moment to strike back with fury. Commanders like Zhukov and Vasilevsky watched Germany's armies stretch thinner and thinner, convinced that Hitler was walking into a trap of his own making. Day by day, the German war machine pushed forward, but the oil never came. Instead of capturing fully functioning refineries, they found ruined structures, burning wells, and facilities deliberately destroyed by retreating Soviet engineers. The prize that had driven this massive campaign was dissolving into smoke before their eyes. And still, Hitler refused to reconsider. His hunger for conquest shifted again. The city named after Stalin, Stalingrad, consumed his obsession. He declared that once the Volga was taken, the Red Army would collapse. The world would witness a victory so monumental it would echo through history. But what Hitler saw as destiny was actually a disaster creeping toward him step by step. His armies were now committed to a brutal struggle on two fronts, deep in hostile territory, with supplies dwindling and winter only months away. Operation Blue was meant to fuel victory. Instead, it became the spark that ignited Germany's greatest defeat. And as the German columns turned toward Stalingrad, they unknowingly marched straight into a nightmare from which few would return. In late summer of 1942, the German Sixth Army finally reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. What they found was not a city ready to surrender, but a broken landscape of fire, steel, and defiance. Bombs from the Luftwaffe had reduced buildings to shattered skeletons. Streets were buried under mountains of rubble. Smoke clung to the sky like a dark, choking curtain. The Germans expected a collapsing enemy. Instead, they were about to step into a fortress, a hell built from the ruins they themselves had created. Urban warfare was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever faced. Their blitzkrieg tactics, lightning-fast tank assaults, sweeping encirclements were now useless. Tanks could barely move through the debris. Every intersection was a death trap. Every window, a sniper's nest. Every pile of brick and twisted metal hid a soldier waiting to strike. The Soviets turned each structure into a battleground. The famous tractor factory was no longer a place of work, but a fortress where rifles were assembled on one floor while grenades exploded in the next. A soldier could fight all day to capture a single building, only to lose it that night to a desperate Soviet counterattack. Progress was measured in meters, paid for with blood. German troops quickly realized a terrible truth. They were not simply fighting the Red Army, they were fighting the city itself. Snipers lurked in the shadows, invisible until their rifles cracked through the silence. Mines were hidden under loose stones. Sewers became secret highways where Soviet units slipped behind enemy lines. The ground beneath Stalingrad was alive with danger. Among these defenders emerged legends. One name spread through German ranks like a curse: Vasily Zaitsev. A hunter from the Ural Mountains, Zaitsev became a ghost of war. With patience and deadly accuracy, he struck without warning, eliminating officer after officer. His presence shattered German morale. They knew that even when the battlefield looked empty, death could be watching them from the ruins. Yet it wasn't just trained soldiers who fought here. Factory workers, students, nurses, ordinary civilians picked up rifles and stood their ground. Some had never fired a gun before, but this was their home, their street, their family buried beneath the rubble. They would rather die here than allow the enemy to move one step further. German commanders were stunned by the level of resistance. They had been promised victory in days. Yet weeks passed, and still the Red Army refused to break. Streets changed hands countless times, each fight more brutal than the last. Bodies piled where they fell. The Volga River ran red as barges carrying reinforcements were shattered by artillery fire before they could even dock. As the fighting dragged on, the psychological toll deepened. Soldiers fought so close that they could hear the enemy breathing on the other side of a wall. Grenades, knives, bayonets, these became the weapons of survival. Fear was constant. Rest was a fantasy. In Stalingrad, there was no safe place, not even for a second. What began as a bold German assault had turned into a grinding slaughter. Hitler demanded victory, no matter the cost. Stalin demanded survival, no matter the sacrifice. And caught between their unyielding wills, were the men dying by the thousands in the rubble. Stalingrad had become a monster, devouring hope, courage, and entire armies. The Germans believed they were closing in on triumph, but in reality, they were sinking deeper into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the German grip tightened around Stalingrad, the Volga River became the city's last breath of survival. This mighty waterway, once a symbol of industry and progress, was now a desperate lifeline. The only route through which food, ammunition, and reinforcements could reach the defenders clinging to the western shore. Without the Volga, Stalingrad would suffocate. The river itself was a battlefield. Under the constant roar of Luftwaffe bombers and the thunder of German artillery, Soviet supply boats raced across the water, fragile shadows moving through smoke and carnage. Many never made it. Barges burst into flames. Mid-crossing, bodies and debris drifted downstream with the current. Yet, despite the terror, more and more soldiers crossed toward the burning skyline ahead. They knew that once they reached the city, they might never return. Among these reinforcements were young cadets barely old enough to shave, workers who had laid down their tools, and women who refused to abandon their homes. They stepped off the boats into chaos, a city screaming with explosions and gunfire. And still, they pushed forward, carrying crates of ammunition or dragging the wounded to safety, fighting against both the enemy and the collapsing ruins around them. The ferrymen of the Volga became heroes in silence. They navigated the river again and again, ignoring the fiery rain that fell from the skies. Many carried the same terrified soldiers they had just watched praying moments earlier. Their boats were patched with bullet holes, stained with oil and blood, but they kept going. The order was simple: cross or die trying. All the while, Soviet commanders knew the impossible burden placed on these men and women. Stalingrad's defenders were fighting with their backs against the river. Retreat was not an option. Anyone attempting to flee without orders risked being shot by NKVD blocking units stationed on the shore. There would be no escape, no surrender, only victory or silence. Every night, the riverbanks became a frantic exchange point. Fresh troops running into the ruins while the wounded staggered back toward the water. Faces pale from shock, uniforms torn from battle. Some never reached the boats, collapsing only steps away from rescue. Others refused evacuation entirely, choosing to stay with their comrades and fight until their last breath. In the factories by the river, production never stopped, even as bullets shattered windows and bombs cratered the floors. Workers built weapons during the day and defended those same walls at night. It was not simply military strategy. It was survival driven by love for motherland and fear of annihilation. Despite all the blood and sacrifice, the Volga never failed them. As long as the Red Army could cross that river, Stalingrad would stand. Hitler believed the Soviets were trapped, cornered against an uncrossable barrier. But in truth, the river gave them strength. It delivered hope. It carried reinforcements who replaced every soldier lost in the ruins. And with every crossing, the German dream of capturing Stalingrad slipped deeper and deeper out of reach. The city refused to die. It refused to submit. Because every night, beyond the burning smoke, the Volga kept bringing more defenders, ready to fight, ready to bleed, and ready to turn the tide of history. If Stalingrad was a nightmare on Earth, then the sky above it was the gateway to hell. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the most powerful air force in the world, unleashed its fury upon the city with relentless precision. Day after day, German bombers roared across the horizon, blotting out the sun, turning the sky black with smoke and ash. Their mission was simple: erase Stalingrad from the map. The first wave struck with terrifying impact. High explosives blasted open factories, rail yards, hospitals, and schools. Then came incendiary bombs, hissing fire that crawled across rooftops and swallowed entire streets. In a single week, more than 40,000 civilians were killed. Mothers searching for their children vanished under collapsing walls. Firestorms pulled oxygen from the air itself. And those trapped beneath rubble gasped in silence as flames devoured everything around them. This was a show of dominance, a demonstration of overwhelming power. They believed the city would crumble under shock and terror, but in their destruction, they unknowingly gave the Soviets a weapon. The ruins they created became fortresses, dense terrain where tanks were useless and infantry movements became deadly slow. What was once a modern industrial city was now a labyrinth of broken concrete and jagged steel, and every shattered room became a place to hide, to fight, and to kill. Still, the air assaults never truly stopped. Even as Soviet soldiers clung to narrow strips of land along the Volga, the bombs rained down. The river itself seemed to burn at times as destroyed fuel depots spilled flames across the water. Ferries carrying reinforcements were torn apart mid-crossing. Thousands drowned before ever reaching the shore. Yet more boats followed, driven by a determination stronger than fear. The civilians who survived those initial attacks faced a world of dread. Families hid in cellars that doubled as graveyards when ceilings gave way. Children learned to judge danger by the whistling pitch of falling bombs. When sirens stopped working, the sky became the warning, and in the dark of night, the glow of burning districts lit up the horror. A constant reminder that nowhere was safe. And dawn did not promise mercy. For the Luftwaffe pilots, Stalingrad became a mission of endless repetition. Take off. Destroy, return, and prepare to do it all again. Some believed their actions would end the war sooner, sparing their families from further suffering. Others, shaken by the chaos below, wondered if this level of annihilation could ever truly bring peace. As the battle dragged on, the skies began to reveal the first cracks in German air supremacy. Soviet fighter aces rose to challenge them, their aircraft fewer in number but fierce in spirit. Every German plane lost meant one less hammer striking the city below. The tide was subtle at first, but it was shifting. By turning Stalingrad into a smoking crater, the Luftwaffe had intended to break the Soviets. Instead, they had built a fortress of wrath and resilience. The city's defenders now fought not for orders or ideology, but for revenge. The flames that reduced their homes to ash ignited something far more dangerous, a promise that the invader would pay dearly for every inch gained. In the scorched skeleton of Stalingrad, the German advance slowed. The city burned, but it did not fall. While Stalingrad burned, far away in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, Adolf Hitler sat convinced that victory was inevitable. He believed the German Sixth Army, once considered the most formidable fighting force in the world, would crush everything in its path. The Führer's pride demanded that Stalingrad fall, no matter the cost. And trapped beneath that crushing ambition was one man, General Friedrich Paulus. Paulus had spent his career as a meticulous planner, a strategist who studied maps more than he fired weapons. Now he was commanding an army of more than 250,000 men, in the most brutal urban combat the world had ever seen. His soldiers were exhausted, freezing, and running low on supplies. Yet Hitler's demands only grew louder. Stalingrad must be taken, he ordered at all costs. At first, Paulus believed in the mission. His troops had pushed deep into the city. They controlled most of the west bank of the Volga. German newspapers proclaimed victory at hand. But Paulus could see the reality in the eyes of his men. Fear, hunger, and a dawning horror that the enemy would not break. Every day, they bled for a small patch of rubble that would be lost again the next morning. Paulus sent desperate messages back to headquarters, begging for reinforcements, ammunition, food, anything. But Hitler refused. Instead, he promised resources that never arrived. The Führer, a obsession with capturing the city named after his rival, blinded him to the truth. The German advance had stalled. Stalingrad had already consumed too much. And while Hitler clung to his pride, the Soviets adapted. General Zhukov and his front line. Commanders perfected a strategy known as hugging the enemy. Soviet troops fought as close to German positions as possible, sometimes separated only by a thin wall or a single staircase. This tactic neutralized German artillery and air support. The Luftwaffe could not bomb without risking their own soldiers. Paulus was trapped in a fight designed to grind his army into dust. Under this pressure, the Sixth Army began to fray. Discipline slipped. Morale shattered. Soldiers scavenged abandoned supplies and hunger gnawed their strength away. Fresh German recruits were horrified by what they saw. Comrades with thousand-yard stares, corpses frozen where they fell, trenches filled with more dead than living. Yet Hitler demanded they press on. His pride insisted that retreat was unthinkable. And so Paulus obeyed, marching deeper into a trap he could no longer avoid. He understood the terrible truth. Every new attack brought them closer to annihilation. Every new order felt like a death sentence. Meanwhile, the Red Army was not retreating, it was preparing. Massive reserves were gathering beyond the horizon, hidden from German eyes. Tanks, artillery, infantry, all being positioned for a strike that would change the course of the entire war. And still, Hitler raged. He refused to listen to his generals. He refused to consider withdrawal. His pride was no longer a source of strength, but the chain that would drag his army into oblivion. General Paulus was now a commander with no control, a chess piece trapped on a burning board. Stalingrad was no longer his battlefield, it had become his nightmare. And as winter crept closer, that nightmare was only beginning. Night still smothered the French countryside as thousands of Allied paratroopers soared through the storm-filled sky. Inside the rumbling C-47 aircraft, young soldiers tightened their helmet straps, clutched their rifles, and stared at the dim red light above the jump door, the silent countdown to chaos. They were the first wave. The ones who would land far behind enemy lines with no guarantee of support, rescue, or survival. The air smelled of fuel and adrenaline. Prayers whispered in the dark were swallowed by the roar of engines. Suddenly the sky erupted. German anti-aircraft guns fired tracer rounds that streaked like flaming arrows through the night. Pilots swerved violently to avoid being torn apart, causing paratroopers to tumble and collide inside the plane. The red light turned green. A shout pierced the air. Go, go, go! And one by one, they leaped into the unknown. The cold wind tore at their uniforms as parachutes snapped open above fields, rivers, and enemy machine gun nests. Many landed exactly where they trained to be. Many more did not. In the blackness below, confusion ruled. Some paratroopers crashed through trees, breaking bones on impact. Others fell into flooded marshes, drowning under the weight of equipment they could not remove in time. Radios failed. Units scattered. A mission built on precision was swallowed by disarray. Yet those who survived the landing did not hesitate. They cut themselves free, rallied whoever they could find, and moved toward their objectives. Bridges, roads, and German strongholds that had to be taken before dawn. Throughout Normandy, small pockets of American and British troops launched fearless assaults with no idea if help would ever arrive. They attacked enemy checkpoints, sabotaged communication lines, and fought with a determination that stunned German forces. Every skirmish bought precious minutes for the invasion force, still fighting their way up the beaches. By sunrise, Europe would know that the paratroopers had succeeded. Their deadly descent from the sky had opened the path to liberation, one desperate, heroic step at a time. As the sun climbed above the chaos of Normandy's shores, the enormity of the mission sharpened into focus. The beaches had been taken at a terrible cost, but victory on the sand meant nothing if the Allies could not break free from the steel trap waiting just beyond the dunes. German artillery still thundered from the hedgerows, and hidden machine gun nests turned every step inland into a gamble between life and death. Exhausted soldiers wiped salt water and blood from their faces, tightened their grips on mud-covered rifles, and prepared for the next battle, knowing the hardest part had only just begun. The Norman countryside, picturesque at first glance, quickly revealed itself to be a perfect fortress. Tall hedges formed thick, nearly impenetrable walls around tiny fields, a maze designed by nature but improved by German engineering. Snipers lurked behind leaves. Mortars were hidden under barns. Every farmhouse could become a fortress. Every road, a killing zone. Sherman tanks struggled to maneuver, their armor scored by German shells fired from positions they could barely see. And yet the soldiers pushed on, crawling, fighting, and bleeding for every inch of ground. Communication stretched thin. Units became separated in the labyrinth of bocage terrain. Officers made split-second decisions with lives hanging on their words. Medics rushed forward under fire, dragging wounded men into whatever shallow cover they could find. Hands soaked in bandage-covered desperation. Despite fatigue and fear, the spirit that carried them across the channel, the belief that Europe could be freed, drove them forward. Each field taken was a message to Hitler's regime. The end has begun. By evening, Allied positions deepened, supply lines strengthened. And for the first time since the boots of American, British, Canadian soldiers touched French soil that morning, commanders looked toward the horizon with cautious hope. The beaches behind them were secure. Ahead lay the long road to Paris, and beyond that, the promise of victory over tyranny. The world held its breath, watching men transform from soldiers into legends, one battle, one field, one sacrifice at a time. Behind the front lines, in villages and cities scarred by occupation, another battle raged quieter, deadlier, and invisible to the naked eye. The French resistance moved like shadows through the countryside, sabotaging German supply lines, cutting telephone wires, and planting explosives along railroads that carried reinforcements and ammunition to the front. Their actions were small in scale, but immense in consequence, turning what had once seemed a smooth German advance into chaos and confusion. The people who made up the resistance were not soldiers by training. They were farmers, teachers, students, and ordinary men and women who refused to bow under tyranny. They learned to hide in attics, crawl through sewers, and deliver messages under the noses of the Gestapo. Each act of defiance carried a risk of death, a gamble they embraced without hesitation. They knew the Allies depended on them, that every sabotaged bridge, delayed train, or hidden mine could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Intelligence was the lifeblood of their struggle. Agents infiltrated German headquarters, memorizing troop movements and supply schedules. They transmitted their findings across secret radio networks, whispering critical information into the ears of Allied commanders. Time and again, these messages turned the tide in small but decisive ways, ambushing reinforcements, diverting artillery fire, saving countless lives on the beaches and in the fields of Normandy. The resistance also became a moral force, reminding both soldiers and civilians that France had not surrendered its spirit. Every act of sabotage, every whispered warning, every hidden weapon was a declaration. The country still fought, even if its army had been forced to retreat. Their courage inspired the Allies as much as the battlefield victories themselves. It proved that the fight against tyranny was not only waged in open combat, but in the hearts and actions of ordinary people willing to risk everything for freedom, by combining their knowledge of the terrain with daring ingenuity. The resistance slowed the German response, ensuring that the momentum gained on D-Day could be maintained. Without them, the push inland might have faltered. With them, every step forward became possible, every bridge seized, every village liberated, every inch of Normandy reclaimed. And so, in the dark alleys, hidden fields, and secret cellars of France, ordinary citizens became extraordinary heroes, proving that wars are not only won by soldiers with rifles, but also by those willing to strike in silence, strike with cunning, and strike for the future of their homeland. As the Allies pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy, their eyes turned toward Caen, a city that had been promised as an early objective, yet had become a fortress of German resistance. For weeks, soldiers fought not just for territory, but for survival, as every street, every building, and every hill became a battleground. Caen was a city under siege, and its destruction would test the endurance of both men and machines. The terrain itself became an enemy. Roads were mined. Bridges were rigged to collapse. Fields were dotted with hidden artillery positions. Tanks maneuvered cautiously, knowing that a single ambush could shred armor and lives in an instant. Infantry followed behind, moving cautiously through hedgerows and rubble. Wary of snipers whose bullets could come from any direction, the city was not only defended by soldiers but also by the very landscape itself, turned into a deadly trap by both nature and the retreating German forces. Caen's defenders were well prepared and determined. They knew the city's fall could tilt the campaign, and they fought with a ferocity that slowed the Allied advance day after day. German machine guns cut through open fields. Mortar rained down from high ground. Artillery shells shattered buildings into ruins, even as soldiers scrambled for cover. The battle became a grueling test of endurance, of patience, courage, and sheer willpower. Meanwhile, Allied forces adapted. Engineers cleared mines under fire. Tank units provided cover for advancing infantry. Soldiers coordinated across platoons despite broken lines of communication. The fight was relentless. Each gained street required hours of combat and often ended with heavy casualties. Yet, every small victory brought the Allies closer to breaking the German defensive line and securing the momentum necessary for the liberation of Normandy. The human cost was staggering. Soldiers and civilians alike were caught in the inferno. Families buried under rubble. Men frozen in fear, exhaustion, or wounds. Medics raced through streets under fire, dragging the wounded to safety. Even in the chaos, stories of heroism emerged, comrades risking everything to save each other. Small bands of soldiers holding strategic positions against impossible odds, and citizens hiding in cellars, praying for the war to pass them by. By the end of the battle, Cannes was largely destroyed. A city of ruins standing as a testament to both human tenacity and suffering. But the relentless fighting had achieved its purpose. The German defenders were exhausted, their resources depleted, and the road to liberation remained open. Cannes had resisted fiercely, but it could not withstand the determined advance of Allied forces combined with the sacrifices of countless soldiers. Engineers and medics who refused to yield, Cannes was more than a city. It was a symbol of the struggle, a measure of courage, strategy, and endurance. And as the Allies prepared to push further into France, they carried with them the lessons learned in its streets. Victory would come only at a cost, and every step forward demanded unrelenting determination. After weeks of relentless fighting, the tide of war finally began to shift in Normandy. The sacrifices of thousands of soldiers, the courage of ordinary civilians, and the unyielding spirit of the French resistance had combined to turn a bloody beachhead into a foothold for liberation. The Allies were no longer just storming beaches, they were pushing forward with momentum. Determined to reclaim a nation and strike a decisive blow against tyranny. Liberation was not immediate, nor was it without cost. Towns and villages lay in ruins, bombed and shelled into rubble. Families returned to homes that had been destroyed or looted, finding only memories and debris. Soldiers marched through streets that still smelled of smoke and blood, countering pockets of resistance that fought to the last man. Every step inland demanded courage, every victory a reminder of the sacrifices made along the way. The French resistance, whose silent struggle had weakened the enemy from within, now emerged openly to support the advancing Allied forces. Former teachers, farmers, and clerks guided troops through hidden paths, helped secure key positions, and provided intelligence that saved countless lives. Their bravery had shifted the balance in ways visible and invisible, proving that the fight for freedom was not just fought by armies in uniforms, but by every individual willing to stand against oppression. With each liberated village and captured city, the psychological impact was immense. German forces, once confident and seemingly invincible, began to retreat, demoralized and overstretched. The Allies' momentum became unstoppable. Tanks rolled through open fields where soldiers had once fought desperately for every inch of ground. Artillery barrages gave way to careful occupation and coordination. As towns were reclaimed and order slowly restored, by the end of the campaign, Normandy was no longer a battlefield of uncertainty, but a staging ground for the liberation of France and the final push toward Germany itself. The courage, sacrifice, and strategy displayed in these weeks demonstrated the unbreakable spirit of those who fought, soldiers and civilians alike, and set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Axis powers. Stalingrad, D-Day, the battles across France all were turning points that proved one undeniable truth: tyranny can be resisted, no matter how formidable it seems. Every act of bravery, every choice to fight rather than flee, every life risked for freedom contributed to the ultimate victory. And as Allied flags rose over liberated towns, the world witnessed the promise that humanity, even in its darkest hours, could prevail. The battle for freedom was not just fought on the beaches or in the streets. It was fought in hearts, in courage, and in the determination to rise against impossible odds. This was the turning tide of history, a moment when hope, sacrifice, and valor reshaped the world forever.